It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when David's life as he knew it ended. He was sorting through his emails at his sleek, modern desk in his high-rise apartment, the soft hum of the city outside the windows a constant companion. He had just finalized the design for a new commercial building, a project that was poised to boost his career even further, the kind of success he always dreamed of. But amidst the emails and blueprints, there was an unexpected message, tucked among the routine correspondence. It was from a friend. The subject line, brief yet cryptic, "You should know about Emily." David hesitated. He knew the sender, Greg, an old college buddy who worked in real estate development. He had never been one to meddle in personal affairs, and David couldn't fathom why Greg would send such a message. His thumb hovered over the mouse, the cursor blinking, urging him to open it. A mix of curiosity and dread filled him, and in that moment, he wondered if his life was about to change forever. With a deep breath, David clicked on the email. "I think you should know what's been happening. You've always been a good friend, so I can't just sit on this. I've seen Emily with someone. Not just once, but multiple times. I wasn't sure if it was my place, but you need to hear it from someone who cares. I think you should look into it." The message was short. No explanation of who, no details. Just a cold, unsettling truth wrapped in ambiguity. David sat still, his hand frozen above the mouse, his mind trying to piece together what he had just read. He stared at the screen, unable to shake the feeling that someone was slipping away from him. He didn't need to ask who. He knew. Emily, his wife of 10 years, the woman he'd trusted more than anyone, had betrayed him. But by whom? And how? David couldn't bring himself to open any more emails. Not yet. He closed his laptop, trying to calm the storm in his chest. But the weight of it, the slow, creeping realization, pressed on him, suffocating him. It wasn't just the thought of her betrayal, it was the knowledge that someone close enough to have seen it, had been hiding this from him. The apartment, once filled with the hum of design and quiet moments spent with Emily, now felt hollow. The walls seemed to press in on him, the sharp angles of his work no longer comforting but jarring. He had to know the truth. He had to see it for himself. But the question gnawed at him. What would he do when he found it? Would he confront her, leave her, or would he strike back? David didn't sleep that night. After pacing the apartment for hours, he found himself at the small bar cart in the living room, pouring a glass of whiskey he barely tasted. The golden liquid swirled in the glass as his mind churned. Greg's email had been a crack in his carefully constructed world, and David couldn't stop the flood pouring through it. Emily had always been the center of his life. They had met at an architecture exhibition years ago. She had admired his designs with a curiosity that felt genuine, her bright smile as intoxicating as the wine they had shared that evening. She had supported his ambitions, stood by him through late nights and stressful deadlines. Or so he thought. By dawn, David knew he couldn't rely on half-truths and vague warnings. He needed proof. Cold, undeniable proof. And if Greg had seen something, others might have too. The first move was simple. David hired a private investigator. He had never considered doing something so drastic, but the situation demanded it. The investigator, a grizzled man named Price, listened to David's story without judgment, taking notes on a battered tablet. "You want surveillance," Price said after a moment, his voice even. "Photos? Records of meetings, that kind of thing?" David nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought. "Yes, and I want to know who the other man is." Price gave a curt nod. "It'll take time, but I'll find what you're looking for." The meeting left David hollow. He returned to his apartment, the sleek, modern lines of his home now feeling like a cage. Emily's absence that evening, which he'd always brushed off as late work meetings or time with friends, now felt like a glaring sign. Every sound of the city outside seemed to mock him, a reminder of the chaos he had once called inspiration. For the next week, David lived in limbo. Every time Emily came home late or avoided his questions about her day, he fought the urge to confront her. He rehearsed lines in his head, imagined shouting, accusations, tears, but when the moment came, he stayed silent. It wasn't just fear. It was strategy. He couldn't tip his hand too soon. The first real crack came when Price called, his voice sharp and businesslike. "We need to meet." David drove to a cafe on the edge of town, its dim lighting and quiet corners perfect for the kind of conversation he dreaded. Price slid an envelope across the table without a word. David opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, Emily with Victor Kane, the infamous real estate mogul David had clashed with for years. They were sitting at a secluded table in an upscale restaurant, their heads close together. In another photo, they were walking arm in arm into a luxury hotel. David stared at the images, his breath shallow. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Victor Kane wasn't just any man. He was the man who had stolen clients, undercut bids, and spread rumors to tarnish David's reputation in the industry. And now he had taken Emily too. David set the envelope down, his hands steady despite the rage simmering beneath the surface. "What else do you have?" Price hesitated, then slid a small recorder across the table. "I tapped their phones. There's more where this came from." David pressed play. Victor's voice filled the air, smooth and arrogant. He spoke of his plans for Emily, his disdain for David, and his smug satisfaction at having won. David listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When the recording ended, he placed the device in his pocket and stood. "Do you want to confront them?" Price asked, his tone neutral. David shook his head.
"No.
Not yet." As he drove home, his mind was clear for the first time in days. Confronting them wouldn't be enough. No shouting match or accusation could undo what they had done. If Victor Kane thought he had won, David would let him believe it for now. But the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. David's morning began with the kind of focus he hadn't felt in years. The sun filtered through the massive windows of his studio, casting long shadows on the drafting table where he sketched his designs. But today, his work wasn't for a new skyscraper or luxury condominium. It was for something far more personal, a blueprint for revenge. For days, he had replayed the photos, the recordings, and the smug satisfaction in Victor Kane's voice. Confronting him or Emily directly would only feed their egos. No, David wanted something more permanent, something that would topple Victor's empire and leave him scrambling for the pieces. But first, he needed to understand his enemy. David started by diving into Victor's public and private lives. He spent hours combing through real estate deals, corporate filings, and social media accounts. Victor's flashy public persona was a mask for a much darker reality. Bribes to inspectors, blackmail to secure contracts, and a network of shell companies to hide illicit money. Victor's empire was built on quicksand, and David planned to make it collapse. His first breakthrough came when he found an obscure reference to Arden Heights, a new luxury development Victor was pushing. The project was ambitious, a sprawling complex of high-end condos, retail spaces, and green zones, all marketed as a symbol of modern opulence. The city council had been reluctant to approve it due to environmental concerns, but Victor's influence had pushed it through. David grinned. Arden Heights would be Victor's Achilles heel. He reached out to old contacts, engineers, legal consultants, and even a few contractors who had worked with Victor before. Over drinks and casual conversations, he painted a picture of curiosity about Arden Heights, collecting whispers of shortcuts taken in the planning phase. It didn't take long to uncover rumors of shoddy construction practices and environmental violations. But it wasn't enough. David needed to get inside. Through a well-placed call to one of Victor's assistants, he offered to design a signature installation for the project, an avant-garde centerpiece to elevate its prestige. Victor's ego couldn't resist the idea of having David, his rival, work for him. Within days, the contract was signed. David sat at his drafting table that night, working late into the hours, but not on the masterpiece Victor envisioned. Instead, he designed something more subtle, a structural flaw hidden within the installation's foundation, one that wouldn't pass inspection unless Victor greased the right palms. It was a flaw so discreet that only a seasoned architect could catch it. Victor would pay to hide it, and when the time came, David would expose it. Emily was no longer a wife to David. She was an unwitting accomplice. Her late nights, her whispered phone calls to Victor, they were part of a pattern he could now predict. He began subtly manipulating her routines, asking about her plans and offering to handle tasks that would give him access to her phone or her laptop. One evening, as she showered, David unlocked her laptop with a password he had guessed months ago, her childhood dog's name. Inside, he found email exchanges with Victor, filled with promises of a future together and disdain for the boring life she shared with David. But one email stood out. Victor had sent Emily a detailed plan to shift assets into offshore accounts, hiding them from prying eyes. David copied the email and forwarded it to a trusted friend in forensic accounting. The response came within hours. "This is gold. Use it wisely." By the end of the week, David had everything he needed. Arden Heights was a ticking time bomb, its foundation riddled with David's invisible sabotage. Victor's financial secrets were ready to be weaponized, and Emily's complicity tied her fate to Victor's inevitable downfall. David sat in the quiet of his studio that night, staring at the plans for Arden Heights. He felt no guilt, no hesitation. They had treated him like a fool, underestimated his resolve. Now, they would see what happened when an architect turned his skills to destruction instead of creation. David's first step was subtle but effective. An anonymous email to the city's building inspection department. The message contained just enough detail to hint at irregularities in Arden Heights. Specifically, that shortcuts might have been taken in the foundation work. 2 days later, a city inspector arrived unannounced at the site. David stayed far from the action but heard through his sources that Victor's team was caught off guard, scrambling to produce paperwork and explain minor discrepancies. The inspection passed, but the seed of doubt had been planted. David knew that in Victor's world, even a small tremor could cause cracks to spread. Victor's arrogance made it easy to manipulate him. At an exclusive industry gala, David approached with a charming smile, congratulating Victor on the scale of Arden Heights. It was a performance, friendly, admiring, deliberately nonchalant. Victor took the bait, grinning and boasting about the project's grandeur. "You should come see it for yourself," he offered, clearly confident that David would be awestruck by his achievement. David feigned hesitation, then agreed, masking his satisfaction. He knew that Victor's invitation was more than an attempt to gloat. It was a chance to observe the site firsthand and confirm that his sabotage was undetected. The trap was set. David visited the Arden Heights construction site under the pretense of professional curiosity. Victor greeted him with his usual smugness, leading him on a tour of the site, pointing out its grandeur and innovative design. But David wasn't there to admire the project. His sharp eyes swept over the construction, confirming that the hidden flaw in his design was fully integrated. The foreman, under pressure to meet deadlines, had cut corners as expected. As Victor gloated, David asked subtle, probing questions about the foundation, masking his satisfaction as he noted every weak point. He left the site knowing two things. Victor suspected nothing, and when the time came, the collapse would be inevitable. David's next target was Victor's overworked and underpaid foreman, Mark. Through a mutual contact, David learned that Mark was unhappy with his treatment. Victor's promises of bonuses had never materialized, and the pressure to cut corners had placed Mark's career in jeopardy. David arranged a chance meeting with Mark at a local bar. A few drinks in, David casually steered the conversation toward Arden Heights, feigning interest in its challenges. Mark, emboldened by alcohol and bitterness, spilled the truth about the rushed deadlines, falsified safety reports, and Victor's blatant disregard for regulations. Mark didn't know it, but his complaints gave David exactly what he needed, insider details to weaponize against Victor. With the information from Mark, David finalized the subtle flaw in the design of Arden Heights' centerpiece. The flaw was invisible to the naked eye but would fail a detailed inspection if uncovered. David sent the updated plans to Victor's team, knowing the foreman wouldn't dare question their integrity after their conversation. Victor, eager to showcase the centerpiece as a symbol of his triumph, approved the plans without hesitation. David watched as the flawed structure was erected, knowing it was only a matter of time before the house of cards began to fall. The Trojan horse was in place, and Victor's own hubris had invited it in. David released his first strike at Victor's reputation through an anonymous tip to a journalist known for exposing corruption. The reporter was provided with evidence of Arden Heights' environmental violations and falsified safety inspections. Details David had pieced together with Mark's help and his own investigations. The story hit the front page of the city's biggest paper within days. Victor's carefully curated image as a visionary developer began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. As investors and city officials scrambled to distance themselves from the project, David knew he had only begun to dismantle Victor's empire. The spectacle was playing out exactly as planned. David's next move targeted Emily. For weeks, he had held on to the incriminating emails and texts between her and Victor, unsure when to use them. Now, with Victor's professional life crumbling, it was time to expose their personal betrayal. He planned it meticulously. At a charity gala, one of Emily's favorite events, David made sure to have a mutual friend invite her and Victor. They arrived separately but couldn't resist slipping away together during the evening. Meanwhile, David used a burner phone to distribute copies of their messages to key guests at the event, prominent figures from their social circles, Victor's investors, and even Emily's closest friends. The texts painted a damning picture of their affair, revealing not only their disloyalty, but also their shared contempt for David. As the whispers grew louder and eyes began darting in their direction, Emily and Victor re-entered the room, oblivious to the storm. Then, someone confronted Victor, a high-profile investor who had just learned of Victor's reckless behavior and was withdrawing his funding from Arden Heights. Victor tried to save face, but the damage was done. Emily, realizing the affair had been exposed, turned pale and fled the room. David stayed at the edges of the chaos, calm and composed, watching as the carefully cultivated lives of Emily and Victor unraveled before everyone they sought to impress. By the time the night ended, Emily's reputation was in tatters, and Victor's remaining supporters were walking away in droves. For David, it was another brick removed from Victor's crumbling empire and Emily's facade of perfection. But the best was still to come. The fallout from the gala rippled through Victor's life like an earthquake. Investors pulled out of Arden Heights, forcing construction to halt. The press dug deeper into the project's finances and unearthed evidence of Victor's offshore accounts. Accounts David had tipped them off to through his forensic accountant contact. Within days, the city council announced an official investigation into the project's numerous violations. News outlets ran exposés detailing Victor's corruption, turning him into a public pariah. Even his most loyal allies began to abandon him. Emily wasn't spared either. Her affair with Victor became the talk of their social circle, and her public image as a devoted wife and philanthropist crumbled. Former friends avoided her, and invitations to high-profile events dried up. But the crowning blow came when the centerpiece of Arden Heights, David's Trojan horse, was inspected following the public scrutiny. The deliberate flaw was uncovered, and Victor was accused of deliberately bypassing safety regulations to push the project forward. The city immediately revoked its approval for Arden Heights, effectively killing the project. Victor's empire, already teetering, collapsed under the weight of lawsuits, fines, and public outrage. David watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. Victor's smug confidence had been replaced with desperation, and Emily's disdain had turned to regret. Yet David wasn't finished. He knew both would soon come crawling back, and he was prepared for their next moves. Emily came to David first, appearing at his studio unannounced one evening. She looked disheveled, her once polished demeanor replaced with desperation. Her voice trembled as she spoke, pleading for forgiveness. "It was a mistake," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was lost, David. I didn't know what I wanted." David let her speak, his expression unreadable. Inside, a storm raged, but he refused to let her see it. Her words felt hollow, her remorse too little, too late. When she finally fell silent, he simply said, "This isn't about forgiveness, Emily. It's about respect, something you lost for me a long time ago. And now, I've lost it for you." She stared at him, her tears drying as his cold tones sank in. He handed her a folder containing finalized divorce papers. "I suggest you sign these and move on." "I already have." As Emily left in silence, David felt a pang of sadness, but it was fleeting. She had made her choice, and so had he. Victor, on the other hand, wasn't as subdued. Days later, he stormed into David's office, his face flushed with anger. "You think you've won?" he snarled, slamming a hand on the desk. "This isn't over." David remained calm, leaning back in his chair. "It's over, Victor. You just don't realize it yet." Victor's bravado faltered as David slid a USB drive across the desk. "That contains copies of the evidence I've collected against you. Financial fraud, safety violations, environmental crimes. You'll find that I've already shared it with the right people." Victor's hand trembled as he picked up the drive. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. David's voice was steady, sharp as a blade. "Because you thought you could take everything from me. My wife, my reputation, my career. You were wrong." Victor left without another word, his swagger replaced by the heavy weight of defeat. David watched him go, feeling a sense of closure. The confrontation wasn't about gloating. It was about reclaiming the power Victor had tried to steal, and David had won. In the weeks that followed, Arden Heights became a symbol, not of luxury and progress, but of hubris and failure. The media dissected Victor's every misstep, and with the project officially cancelled, the half-finished structures were left to rot. Lawsuits piled up, creditors circled like vultures, and Victor's name became toxic in the real estate world. David, meanwhile, unveiled his own project, a modest yet stunning community center he had been quietly designing and funding. Located in a struggling neighborhood, it offered affordable housing, a library, and a green space for families. The building was not just a testament to David's architectural talent, but a symbol of resilience and purpose. The opening day drew a crowd, including many of the city's most influential figures. Reporters, once obsessed with Victor's downfall, shifted their attention to David's work. During a televised interview, a journalist couldn't resist asking, "What inspired this project?" David paused, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes the best way to rebuild is to focus on what truly matters: community, integrity, and purpose. This project is my answer to that." The crowd applauded, but David barely heard it. He wasn't seeking fame or validation. He had already achieved what he needed. His masterpiece wasn't just the building, but the justice he had quietly constructed behind the scenes. As he walked through the center, seeing children playing and families gathering, David felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Victor Kane's empire was in ruins. His assets were frozen, his reputation shattered, and his closest allies had turned against him. Emily, ostracized by their former social circle, retreated into obscurity, leaving only whispers of her fall from grace. David, however, was thriving, not in wealth or public adoration, but in something far more fulfilling: rebuilding lives. The community center had become a cornerstone of the neighborhood, and David found himself spending more time there, mentoring young architects and offering workshops on sustainable design. One afternoon, a teenager approached him with wide eyes and a sketchbook in hand. "I want to build something like this one day," the boy said, his voice tinged with both awe and determination. David smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You will, and it'll be even better." These moments reminded David why he had become an architect in the first place. Not for accolades or wealth, but for the joy of creating something meaningful. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened by anger or betrayal. The community center became a symbol of his redemption, not just for the neighborhood but for himself. In helping others, he rediscovered his own purpose, turning the pain of the past into a foundation for something far greater. Yet, in the quiet hours, when the city lights flickered outside his apartment, David would reflect on everything that had happened. He didn't regret dismantling Victor and Emily's deceit, but he also realized that his true victory was not in their downfall. It was in his ability to rise above it. His redemption wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about building a life that no betrayal could ever shake. Months after the storm had passed, David sat alone on the rooftop of his new studio, gazing at the city skyline. It was a clear night, the air cool and crisp. He held a glass of wine, not out of celebration but reflection, savoring the quiet moments that had become his solace. The chaos of the past year had left its mark, but David felt lighter now, as if the weight of betrayal had been replaced by something far more enduring: resilience. Victor Kane had disappeared from public life, his empire dismantled and reputation irreparably tarnished. Emily had moved out of the city, her once bright social prospects dimmed to nothing more than a footnote in whispers. David hadn't heard from her since their final confrontation, and he preferred it that way. The community center was thriving, a testament to his ability to rebuild, not just for himself but for others. He visited it often, watching children laugh in the green space, seeing the workshops filled with young minds eager to learn. It was a legacy he could be proud of, one that didn't rely on vengeance or destruction but on creation and hope. As he stared at the glittering city, David thought about the road he had traveled. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been a turning point. It had forced him to examine his life, his choices, and what truly mattered. He raised his glass to the skyline, not in toast to what he had destroyed, but to what he had built. To new foundations, he murmured to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. The past was behind him now. The scars it left served as reminders, not of pain, but of growth. David had turned betrayal into strength, loss into purpose. And as he looked ahead, he realized that the most important architecture wasn't made of steel or glass. It was made of resilience, integrity, and the quiet determination to rise again.